For a long time, the global masses have been closely affiliated with the medium of film as being one of the biggest representatives linked to popular culture. As a result, this phenomenon has been led toward many fans of the medium to branch out into different integrations on how we view different sources through storytelling and beyond. And one of the most notable types of media that has been well occurred throughout the populace's outlook from a Western perspective, this medium namely being anime. Now, anime has been, for the longest time, one of the first few pioneers of animation being made back when the first piece of the oldest animation to be made from Japan was back in 1917. Yet, throughout its earlier history, it hasn't been garnering as much attention as it has been even throughout the golden age of Walt Disney and beyond. And it was only starting to be properly acknowledged by the West at around the early 60s when properly dubbed versions of some certain series were to be released as TV broadcasting to the United States. However, ever since the distribution, it has created an interesting dynamic between what the American audience tend to see what anime is compared to what its native country has to perceive both from a cultural standpoint and what traits does a viewer expect in one type of medium depending on the home country they're from. As a result, this has been culminated into a zeitgeist, where you have the native audience, whose cultural traits typically resonate with the type of visual presentation that they have been grown accustomed to. Whereas on the other hand, you have the foreign audience that has been slowly been adapting to what significances it have to offer compared to its other accessible formats via films and television. All in thanks due in part not just to technological advancements, which yes does help make things easier to access and consume, but part in which it mainly stands from the reception of its fanbase, whose origins are usually met outside the country it was made in. And this is an interesting outlook, because for a while it's always been acutely aware that anime as a whole wouldn't be where it is today without the support of its foreign counterparts. However, once you digest enough to see what directly appeals to the certain type of anime fan, you begin to realize that what could this phenomenon indicate for the future of anime going forward? Hence, this essay is going to inform that question, along with a few brief side journeys that help lead anime into what it is today. When looking back at the whole history of how it all began, it's easy to take a look at what's commended to be the very first animation produced in Japan and view that as the poster child of all things anime. It's also pretty simple to overlook the fact that despite its technical status, it's important to know what certain events are tied into what has shifted anime into what it is today, especially when it dates back to not just the birth of anime, but of it being part of a stage that is currently evolving throughout the infancies of traditional animation. Dating back to the 1950s, American cartoons were starting to make their waves into Japanese television and cinema, with the notable exceptions of Disney films like Snow White that, while despite being produced and shown globally around a decade before that period, it wasn't until 1950 where it was finally released in Japan for its own audience. Following several of their releases, this indicated as a benchmark for many producers who worked on animation at the time, including those who have founded many established production companies that would go on to create many influential works throughout the latter half of the 20th century, including Toei Doga for film and Mushi Productions for television. Now, focusing on the latter, it's hard to overlook what this studio, along with its founder, Tezuka Osamu, has done to make the founding rules of what makes anime so successful to begin with. Firstly, he underlies the following principles for his company when making animation. It would be based on a pre-established source material, the structure of each episode will follow a 30 minutes duration of a continuous plotline, and minimizing the amount of drawings to save budget. Plus, it doesn't hurt to merchandise the primary characters for the series to help fund further production. Now, in hindsight, this would have been considered a very risky move to make, especially when the animation buzz at the time was raked to the brim with 5 to 10 minute episodes, usually consisting a slew of multiple comedic sketches. Yet, despite the chances, it became a resounding success nonetheless, as the first animation they ever produced were going to seize the landmark that would form the basis for many renowned shows and films coming afterwards. And for those of you who are wondering what I'm referring to, you can pretty much guess which show easily claims that title. Now, what made Astro Boy stand out amongst its peers from the West is that following the aforementioned format that the studio has been diluting to with their first ever anime, Tezuka served many of his past experiences and philosophy as main inspirations to what the narrative serves as a major part of the story, since it mainly tackles a wide variety of themes and messages that at the time it was airing in the West, it was revealed to be surprisingly more mature when compared to its counterparts. though the reason for this direction that took place to begin with mainly centered around Tezuka's mindset at the time at what was the point in bringing out to airing despite the glaring risks, stating that, quote, including TV animation, cinema animation, and experimental animation, all the works have been made for an overseas audience. The point for me was that I never lose my independence. Not like the animation producers that do subcontract work for companies overseas to try to get their own work shown in other countries. I wanted to spread our work all over the world and believed my animation and that of the Tezuka production must never lose independence. Now, fast forward a couple of decades later, and that formula began to pivot as the essential format of bringing anime onto television, with some of the shows that have come out in the early 90s are included, but not limited to, Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and Ghost in the Shell, in which what all of these three examples have in common is in how they have pioneered the traditional conventions of what anime is capable of going forward into the modern era. To reiterate the core basis of this essay, things have changed. Whereas Japan was initially perceived to be well known for quote-unquote high cultural products such as haiku, zen, and the martial arts, now it is known as the place where many digitally perceived assets of media, including anime, are being exported from its development that has been in the making for several decades and onward. However, this does not help beg the question as to where this history directly helps to illustrate anime's relationship with its foreign audience, or at the very least when it comes to Western pop culture. Since it has already extended to where you have anime-branded IPs that are marketed outside of its own merchandise, this doesn't exactly address the elephant in the room as to where that foreign dynamic would go from here, and more importantly, why was it even established in the first place? Which is interesting to say the least, because we are now at a certain threshold in which, while managing to display indications of its own roots from an artful standpoint, anime is now seen as a unique excursion in a world where America has been taken for granted with its mass domination across the film world and beyond. But to take things even further, we need to look into what compromises the conceptual difference between its own cultural origins and the discrepancies of its otherwise more outgoing audience. Ever since the widespread acknowledgement of anime right before the 21st century, it has been steadily growing into becoming one of the most globally successful mediums in recent memory, with the United States in particular being offered a regular presence and thus influenced many Western people, both kids and adults alike, from this widespread phenomenon. It was also responsible for inducing many early fandoms during the internet age, where compared to other fan communities, especially ones surrounding Western comics at the time, nowhere has those fandoms had ever been more pronounced and well established as those driven by anime. For example, when San Diego's Comic-Con was only starting out as a gathering place for many media-centric nerds whom, while they were aware of anime's existence at that time, they weren't really about as enthusiastic as one whom you might expect to share the same love for in terms of movies, games, and TV shows, etc. Now, it has become one of the most profitable enterprises to ever grace the convention. It's quite an understatement to describe just how much of an impact that anime has garnered throughout the years, not just in regards to pop culture, but in due to what the general consensus as the identity that anime itself has become in regards to what it initially was back in its heyday. But what's interesting to see is that during the midst of anime's overwhelming growth that occurred overseas, is how in which the people that has been appealed by said anime have been personified as their own mitigation that is derived from what they perceive in their own culture, alongside the culture in which anime is mainly associated with. When talking about the Americanization of anime and manga, Antonia Levy had this to say: I had thought purely in terms of knowledge derived from the content of translated anime and manga, and hoped that this would lead fans to seek out other aspects of Japanese culture. That did happen, but what is even more interesting is the way in which American fans have merged not only the material, but also the fandom traditions from Japan with their own ways that lead to a new hybrid fandom. To put things in an even broader perspective, it is precisely because of their popularity reaching across many different cultures without sacrificing their appeal to its own, and this doesn't just include the US by the way, anime is able to help stimulate its audience through its varied text across many contemporary issues presented within each of their narratives, and often at times in surprisingly complex ways, thus letting anime be taken on a lot more serious note, both from a sociological standpoint and an aesthetic one. Take, for example, the anime film that debatably set the stage for many globalized anime to come forward even before the start of the 21st century. And what else can be said from Otome Katsuhiro's magnum opus, Akira. Now, there is no clear denying of what this film has made for the influence of not just the medium it stems from, but to even go as far out as to influence many different sources of media, including Western cinema, is a certain milestone beyond what is even possible for a piece of anime to achieve, especially at a time when animation in general was marginally seen as an overlooked form of art whose mainstream appeal only hindered the children. But what's interesting about the notion behind its global acclaim is that while Astro Boy marked the beginning to what Japan was initially perceived as from the outside world, Akira solidified it by taking what was formerly a mature look at the sci-fi concept centering around a dystopian future and cranked it up to 11. In terms of its production value at the time, the film itself had the biggest conglomerate of professional animators from several different companies, resulting in what was debatably one of the most ambitious animations that have ever been produced, working together to create something that had the aesthetic and kinetic energy that you would get from a Disney film. However, unlike Disney, Akira fully goes in on the details that renders practically everything on what the film encapsulates. A dystopia that is reveled in destruction and chaos, and said chaos can be followed everywhere else in the world of Neo-Tokyo, both in its distinct outlook on what it used to be, and a harrowing realization on the fate of what it will be if the people living there aren't willing to make changes that will challenge the status quo. And to that extent, it overall serves as a pretty universal message to people that would have otherwise overlooked it in favor of its many memorable set pieces. And even so, the impact that Akira has had over the years cannot be understated in revelation to the globalized masses that have been garnering the attention of this film alongside the other Japanese animated ones that came after. And this marks the difference on why the Western side of the anime fandom takes everything from their favorite series or film that resounds in anime so compassionately. Because in hindsight, with what the media that they have been given over in terms of their own, the Japanese side of pop culture showcases that despite seeing many similarities in both appeal and entertainment factor with the Western side, the methods in which they take certain themes and conventions don't always necessarily abide by the distinct forms of narrative plot beats that we are used to seeing. And it's that appeal that, unlike in what you would see in many conventional forms of movies or television, anime has always been one that pushes the inner boundaries of what is acceptable to display, as well as being accessible to many demographics and alike.
なんかの本のコラムがありましてね、そのコラムにヒトラーの血の中にユダヤ人の血が混じってるという疑いがあるということを誰かアメリカの学者が喋ってるのが一行書いてあったわけ。それが発想なんです。で、後のものは全部付け足しなんです。あれほど評価の変わったスパイっていうのはいないと思うんだけど、それとヒトラーと結びつけちゃったね。これはね、普通結びつけられないですよ。だからそれはもうこっちのそこがフィクションっていうかね、デタラメの最たるところなんだけど、僕の場合の発想ってそういうところなんだね。もうとんでもないものを結びつけると面白いアイデアが出るんだ。落語のあれと一緒ですよ。三大話とね。
Now, to say things in a blunt manner, I'm not directly advocating for what I have stated thus far to be both a direct and definite answer as to what anime has done to reach its popularity today, since there are many other cases that dive deeper into the psychology of the interconnected nature of anime and how that has affected many others outside of Japan. But regardless of the result, I do hope that with this essay there is at least an understanding on how most Westerners today have taken upon the form of anime as being the central significance that has taken place in many people's lives when compared to most other mediums. To put it simply, it is impossible to try and sum up the world of Japanese animation, as it's about as diverse as other media that came before it. But even so, anime has always been one that offers many exhilarating visions on what our world could be like, and to its credit, It's even more so imaginative and related to the point at which live action cannot possibly replicate, even in their straight-to-movie adaptations. However, this is not to say that it can't live up to its own credibility as an art form. Sometimes the world and characters inhabited in anime are not always accurate in measuring up to one's own expectations when they're witnessing it for the first time. Yet others share a deep resonance with the medium, and at the end of the day, isn't it all just up to personal taste? And finally, to summarize the encapsulation of what anime has made for both the commodification and creative liberty approach, I find this particular quote to be the most appropriate. The traditional definition of animation is something that gives movement and life to inert materials. We have seen that anime gives movement and life to any and all fragments of identity in a world that is incessantly unreal. While its technological basis points to society's increasing depths to the machine, its artistic virtuosity underlines the awesome powers of the human imagination.